Okay. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2026 Texas Federal Lands Access Program webinar with prospective applicants. So just a quick intro from me. My name is Andrew Valdez, and I'm a planner with Federal Highways. But I spent many years in local government, and in that time, submitted a number of successful and unsuccessful FLAP applications. So, I've been in your shoes and I'm here to help you through the process. We've slotted a couple hours for today. I've got about 45 slides to go through. So the presentation itself is probably going to take about an hour. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after I'm done. Just a few housekeeping notes and disclaimers and legal mumbo jumbo before we begin. Except for the statutes and regulations cited, the contents of this presentation do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the states or the public in any way. This presentation is intended only to provide information regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. Note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on a public website, the Texas FLAP webpage. This webinar is geared mostly for state and local government agencies or prospective applicants. Since you all own and manage the facilities where FLAP dollars get invested, that means it falls on you to lead the application process, and we'll get into the details of that later on in the presentation. Tomorrow, we've scheduled a webinar for the land management agencies, or FLMAs in Texas, and we'll be flagging this opportunity for them as well. So some of you may start to hear from the parks and forests and wildlife refuges in your areas about potential projects. Also, just note that all application materials have been posted to the Texas FLAP webpage since about the beginning of the month. So those are all ready for your download. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the page, the webpage, we'll go over all of that later in the presentation. And unless otherwise noted, Federal Highways and Adobe stock used under license are the sources of all the images in this presentation. And then finally, this slide deck has been added to the meeting invite, and I'll also be posting it to the FLAP webpage, but I can also just send you a copy if you're having any troubles. Okay, so now that is out of the way. Here's our general outline. This might be review for some of you, but for others, this could be brand new information. So we're going to start with an intro to my agency, Federal Lands Highways, who we are and what we do. Then we'll move on to a full rundown of the access program, or FLAP A to Z. So you guys will all be FLAP experts by the end of this. And then we'll get into the elements of the application packet itself. And then we'll end with the call timeline, some closing items, and then, like I said, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And there are just some key points to look out for with that little yellow notification you can see. Okay, so Federal Lands Highways. We are basically the Department of Transportation for the federal land management agencies. As I'm sure many of you know, about a third of the United States is owned and managed by the federal government. And our office plans, designs, and builds transportation infrastructure within and leading to federal lands. And we have different programs for each, which I'll talk about in a minute. It is really a recreation forward-driven mission. And we do function a lot like a state DOT, and that will deliver most of our projects, although we don't actually own or maintain any transportation assets. The rest of Federal Highways is under the federal aid system, where funding goes to the individual states. And then there are state division offices that have a stewardship and oversight role with state DOTs and other local agencies. So for Federal Lands Highways, we try to capture that in our mission statement here. And this is where Central Federal Lands, which is my office, sits within kind of broader U.S. Department of Transportation. So we're a division of Federal Lands Highways, And you can see the land management agency logos there, who are our main partners for these programs. And this map just shows how the country is divided into different federal land regions. So central, eastern, and western. So once again, I'm in central, and our division office is in Lakewood, Colorado. This is where our team is based out of, I'm based out of, and our territory includes basically from California to North Dakota to Texas and everything in between, including the great state of Texas. These are our core capital programs. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about the Federal Lands Access Program, or FLAP, and then to a lesser extent, the Federal Lands Transportation Program, or FLTP, and how those are supposed to work together. These two programs were set up to address access to and within federal lands, and ideally, they sort of complement and support each other, and we'll get into that angle a little bit later. But the easiest way to think about this is FLTP is for federally owned transportation systems, and then for FLAP is for non-federally owned, but provides access to public federal lands. FLAP projects are programmed through a call for projects, which we opened for Texas earlier this month. And the owner of the facility, or the agency that maintains the facility, has to be the primary applicant. So typically this will be like a state DOT or other local government agency, like the folks on this call representing counties and towns. But the ownership must be non-federal, or the local agency must agree to assume maintenance responsibility in the case of a federally owned route like a forest highway. And we'll get into eligibility a little bit more in a minute here. The FLTP is programmed by the FLMAs themselves, and we don't have much visibility into that process. We just deliver projects for them. And we also have programs for U.S. federally recognized tribes and emergency federal relief. Those are the TTP and ERFO or ERFO. We're not going to spend too much time talking about those today. These are our core programs. Just a little bit more about Central. We have those 14 Western states I showed you on the map, and some Pacific territories, including Hawaii. And we're not just about moving people from A to B. Our federal lands are some of the nation's treasures. And the built infrastructure needs to take into account things like visitor experience and resource conservation. And we're really at the forefront of delivering context-sensitive projects like that. Federal lands, highways, transportation systems serve recreational travel and tourism, protect and enhance natural resources, provide sustained economic development in rural areas, and provide needed transportation access for tribal communities. So overall, we provide funding for more than 90,000 miles of federally owned and public authority owned roads, which serve federal lands. Central federal lands highways sort of fills a niche in the transportation infrastructure ecosystem. Since our projects tend to be very unique, and we have a deep bench both among our staff and the contractors we work with in our two lines of work, both in project delivery and business operations. So all the specialties you see listed on the slide there. So really everything from long-range planning to right-of-way and utilities, NEPA and environmental clearance, project management, planning and other technical services. We really do it all. We're a strong project manager-centric organization. So if you are selected for a project, there'll be a single point of contact assigned in the PM, and you won't have to navigate, a complex federal bureaucracy to get information or manage contingencies. We do operate under performance metrics. So first off, we are project funded, which means we actively track our utilization. And we want to see over 75% of allocated dollars going towards projects and not going towards administration and overhead. We also aim to obligate over 95% of program funds on a yearly basis. So we're not carrying, we're trying not to carry funds over year to year. We really are incentivized to service the clients and get these funds out the door and investment on the ground. Even though we do have a number of architecture and engineering firms on contract, we'll actually deliver the majority of our work in-house, and this keeps our staff trained and up to date. And also as part of project closeout, we'll send out satisfaction surveys, and for there we also shoot for 85% and above. Okay, so moving on to the Access program. This is a program that's authorized by Congress in national transportation legislation. So this first came about in MAP 21 back in 2012. And it's been continued through every transportation bill through our current one, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. IIJA authorized around $300 million per year of its life for the Access program from 2022, and it expires at the end of fiscal 2026. And FLAP's purpose is to improve non-federal transportation facilities that provide access to, are adjacent to, or sometimes located within federal lands, with an emphasis on high-use recreation sites and federal economic generators, which we'll get into later. Okay, so we'll start off with eligibility. So per the legislation, any public highway, road, bridge, trail, trailhead, or transit system located on or adjacent to federal lands is eligible. Improvement activities include rehabilitation, restoration, new construction or reconstruction, engineering and environmental compliance, operations and maintenance of transit facilities, and planning and research. But title and or maintenance responsibility must be vested with a state, county, or local government, or a tribal government. So the non-federal facility owner must be the primary applicant. Or if it's federally owned, like a forest highway, it can be eligible if a local agency consents to maintain the facility through a formal agreement. There were some changes to FLAP under IIJA. There used to be a local match requirement, and now a local match is just optional. It can help in certain scenarios, which I'll get into in a minute here. And there's expanded eligibility for what are called context-sensitive solutions. So these are things that preserve scenic, aesthetic, historic, or environmental resources. So think of like a raised boardwalk over a wetland, or an aquatic organism passage over a stream, for example. And there's also eligibility for signage, wayfinding, landscaping, and other visual mitigations. Typically, those elements by themselves wouldn't be a competitive project. We would want to see the primary component of the transportation of the project be a transportation facility. But now they can be included in a larger project package. So just to make it clear, we'll run through some common eligibility scenarios on the map. So at the top, we've got a road or trail that starts somewhere outside the federal lands and ends somewhere inside the unit boundaries. That whole alignment, the red and the blue, is eligible if the local agency agrees to assume maintenance responsibility for the federally owned portion, the blue part. This sometimes happens when there's, a county or a town that uses the road for secondary purposes, like emergency access, or the road leads to some sort of municipal facility, like a treatment plant or something like that. The second one down is kind of the most straightforward scenario. We've got a locally owned road, starts outside the federal lands and ends at the federal lands boundary, like at a trailhead or a parking lot or a fee station or something like that. The trailhead or parking lot are locally owned and maintained. All of those facilities would be eligible in application. And then there at the bottom, you can have a road or facility that starts outside federal lands, ends short of the unit boundary. That would be eligible as long as it does eventually lead to public federal lands. Typically, we don't want to see anything further than 10 miles from a federal lands boundary or entrance portal, but it doesn't actually have to touch federal lands to be eligible. And just kind of in general, the further a project is away from federal lands boundary, less competitive it's likely to be. Tribal roads maintained by a local tribe are eligible, but the facility must access federal lands other than tribal. So tribal lands are not eligible federal lands as the destination for this program. So for FLAP, tribal entities are sort of more treated like a DOT or a county than an FLNA. And then finally, land leased by the federal government is not eligible. It must be federally owned. This is another scenario that we see sometimes and might be relevant in Texas. So you can have a state park surrounding a reservoir that's managed by the Army Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation. Roads or even water facilities like docks or marinas leading to the water that are within the park are, as long as they're not federally maintained, they're eligible. And that's also an opportunity for leveraged funds to be proposed in an application. So say if like a state park is already planning some transportation improvements to the site, all of those improvements could be bundled into one application for us to deliver. Or the state park could just request FLAP funds and those could supplement project funding. Okay, so that's eligibility. Of course, there are, edge cases and odd projects and stuff that may not fit exactly the mold. So I'm, happy to talk through the specifics of a project you might have in mind, and we can figure out if it's a good fit for the program. All right, so moving on to FLAP funding. It's allocated by a legislative formula, and this has not changed since MAP 21. And essentially, it's a function of the percentage of federal lands within a state and the federal public roadway mileage by state. And this is how funding shakes out on a national basis. So unsurprisingly, Western states are favored in this program. Texas federal land mass is approximately 3.2 million acres, which accounts for about 1.9% of the land in Texas. So Texas annual FLAP allocation is only about $3.2 million a year. That's not a ton of money in the transportation world. But if we're talking things like unpaved roads, trails, natural surface trailheads, planning and research projects, and then leveraged opportunities with partners, that funding can start to go a little farther. And then keep in mind, we will typically program anywhere from 2 to 4 years of funding in any call. So, we could be talking upwards of $10 million worth of projects in this call. And I think we've got a couple hands up. Let me just get through the presentation here, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. All right. The latest transportation legislation, IIJA, did remove the local map, but this is what the match requirements used to be. So in previous years, Texas applicants had to come up with a 20% local match. This does help with lowering the barrier to entry for some less well-resourced local agencies. But of course, that puts pressure on limited program dollars. As I was saying before, there are instances where it does make sense for a local or state agency to want to partly or mostly fund a project with other funds and just use FLAP as a supplemental funding source. And then they could use our office to deliver the project. That's not totally uncommon, and of course helps us expand the program in any one state. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but generally if you've got a roadway where say half of the daily traffic is accessing a federal land unit and the rest of the usage is either local or through traffic, we would want to see commensurate local funding proposed in the application. Okay, so now on to funds leveraging. So we don't use proposed leverage funds as a scoring criteria, but to the extent applicants can bring additional resources to the table, again, we can kind of expand the program in the state and deliver more projects. Here's a rundown of eligible leverage funding sources. So cash match with federal aid or other local general funds is kind of the most straightforward and preferred. FLTP, so Federal Lands Transportation Program dollars, can also count as leverage funds. Again, the FLTP is the program for federally owned transportation assets. And we've made the FLMAs aware of this possibility. But in general, if there's an FLTP project and the need extends beyond the federal boundaries, it would make sense to bundle those projects into one package for us to design and deliver. There's savings that can be realized when we do projects like that. And there's a place to indicate that in the application, which I'll point out. Unlike other federal grants, we can match FLAP funds with other federal competitive sources. FLAP is unique that way, so sometimes FLAP can be used to supplement funds that may have already been awarded in a larger grant program, like Build or Infra. And they may even improve the scoring of an application, as it would lower the risk profile of a project, so that's always something to keep in mind. We also work with the applicants to develop a payment program that's flexible. So, for example, a county was contributing general fund dollars on a project. They don't need to have all those funds available up front. And we do that through reimbursable agreements, and the applicant is invoiced as construction progresses. And just to note, we can't receive private or nonprofit funding directly. This is a little more on the FLAP, FLTP leverage angle. As I said, these two programs can be bundled, and we do like to see that. There are some conditions. The Programming Decision Committee, or PDC, and FLMA concur on the project. So a little bit more on the PDC later. The projects need to be contiguous or at least adjacent to each other. And the project has to be managed as one delivery package so that we can realize those economies of scale. And kind of depending, the PDC may also require the local agency to contribute some funding, but this is sort of figured out on a case-by-case basis. And here's just a graphic example of how a joint FLTP, FLAP project could work. So say we have a $1 million flat project to improve a county road to the entrance of a national forest, shown there in blue. And then separately, there's an FLTP project to improve the scenic drive to the parking area, that segment there in red. Those projects could be combined into one FLAP application, and this really has benefits to all parties. The applicant has a low or no cost burden. They can have us design and deliver the project, and then they get to claim leverage funds on the application. This is also great for us because it's much cheaper to deliver one larger project than to mobilize for two smaller projects separated by a period of years. And again, we've made this opportunity, the FLMA is aware of this possibility since they're the ones that know about the programming for their transportation program. So hopefully there are some projects, that are already in the pipeline that line up with the needs on the local access system. All right, so moving on to project delivery. As I mentioned earlier, CFL does typically lead and deliver selected projects, and there's a place to indicate this, and I'll point that out when we go through the application. That's because this is our business model and part of our mission to deliver the program. There are some exceptions to this, like major highways, bridge repairs, or transit projects, but they are kind of rare. If a state or local agency does want to deliver the project, there are some guidelines around that. There should be a justification for it, such as the state DOT is already underway with the project and they're looking for supplemental funds. In those cases, the Federal Highway State Division Office and state DOT will have stewardship and oversight. So there's some reporting that goes along with that. And then FLAP funds would then be fixed at a set amount. So the PDC would come and say, hey, FLAP can contribute up to, X amount of dollars. And then it's up to the project sponsors to make that amount work. Okay, so who makes the programming and funding decisions? Each state has a programming decisions committee, or PDC. This is a 3-person volunteer board that's established by a charter and made up of a state DOT rep, a local government rep, and then our office, Federal Highways, has 1 seat. You can see sort of the PDC responsibilities there, but it's essentially their task to ensure proper stewardship of the program funds from a statewide perspective. It's not their job to, advocate for special projects in their districts or anything like that. Now, what you don't see here is FLMA representation on the PDC. Each state has an FLMA technical advisory group, or what we call a TAG. These are typically FLMA reps from regional or national levels, and they do advise the PDC, but they don't have a vote on the PDC. We give the asset owners the final say, but feedback from the tags is important. So, the FLMAs do play a critical role in deliberations. Okay, so moving on to preferred projects. So preference is given to transportation facilities providing access to high-use recreation sites and federal economic generators. That's actually written into the legislation. Federal recreation is defined as any site used by the public to recreate on federal lands, so pretty straightforward. High use is defined for a region or local area and not compared across the state or entire country. So not every county is going to have the Grand Canyon, for example, right? And then federal economic generators are defined as any use of or on federal lands that increases aggregate investment or economic activity for a local community and or region. So think, ski areas, in some cases, energy production sites, anything that has a national draw or like a major employment center. But again, the underlying ownership does have to be federal. And these are the projects that we like to see, starting with full reconstruction or rehabilitation of a roadway. Anything that expands modal access to a federal unit, like a new bike lane or new multi-use path, accessibility improvements, wholesale bridge replacements, safety enhancements, things like access portals, trailheads, parking lot improvements are also good projects because they also serve to expand or enhance access. Some of this is a judgment call, obviously, but if we see a reasonable scope, realistic project estimate, and good FLMA coordination, the project will kind of meet the program vision, and that's going to be a strong project. We also love to see partnerships. They can really take a project, I think, from good to great when multiple agencies work together on an application and deliver a project that everyone is happy with. This can leverage funds or local knowledge and addresses projects of mutual interest and greatest need. Many complex projects require a coalition of local champions to get them moving and funded. So, sometimes the more partners at the table, the more resilient a project can be. And just to keep in mind, really our goal is to service the partners and deliver quality projects that the public and public agencies want, so that broad coalitions are always like a good sign for us. Okay, so moving on to weak applications. We typically don't like to do maintenance-only projects. The purpose of the program is to expand access, not patch up something that has underlying major flaws or to address a county's deferred maintenance backlog. We also want to do complete projects. We wouldn't want to do a project where an underlying issue or problem isn't addressed. So say if like a road has an outdated design or poor subgrade, and those elements aren't addressed in the application, that would weaken the overall project. Obviously, unclear or poorly written applications don't fare well. Make sure you pick logical termini. It wouldn't make sense to build, a 4-lane road that ends at a 1-lane bridge. That's an extreme example, but, think about the start and end points of your project. Pictures and maps are always helpful. So whatever context you can provide to clearly communicate the purpose and need of the project. We also have a section to add a link to a video file or recorded YouTube. These are helpful, I think, like a dash cam video, helpful in assessing applications and kind of seeing the true state of affairs on the ground. Of course, the project must meet basic eligibility criteria, and we do always want to see good coordination with the land management agencies. Sometimes we see applications that seem more like urban or rural commuter routes or neighborhood streets, and then the federal lands access component is like a minority of traffic counts. Those projects can be eligible, but in cases like those, again, we would want to see commensurate local funds, since the federal access component is secondary to, local needs. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the application and application process. So the links you see at the top of the slide there will take you to the main FLAP landing page and to the Texas page. And there you'll see a map of the US and other info about the access program. So Texas is currently green, which means the process is open and we're accepting applications. Generally, a call for projects is open anywhere from 70 to 90 days, and we try to schedule calls every 3 to 4 years, depending on funding availability, our resources internally, and then other projects we're doing in the state. And the reason we do it that way instead of a yearly call is because we don't want the size of a state's allocation to drive programming decisions. We would rather develop a quality multi-year program, and we don't want to constrain ourselves to an artificial yearly number. So if you click on Texas, this is what the state's page looks like. And this is where all the application materials and call timeline is. And I'll also post any updates here. So while the call for projects is open, I suggest go ahead and bookmarking this page. Information about your local PDC members is also here in case you have questions for any of them. I'll also post the slide deck and video recording of today's webinar here. And we'll get into the application now. So it's a pretty light lift at 8 pages total. So if you have all the information for your project already sort of gathered and organized, you probably knock it out in a day or two. We've tried to make the forms as straightforward and self-explanatory as possible. And in the application PDF, I've provided a lot of sample text, try and give you a sense of what we're looking for with each question. Make sure to take out the sample text and put in yours, or leave it empty if the item doesn't apply to your project. We're not going to go line by line, but I'll just kind of point out the important elements of the application. And then, of course, I'm available if you want to follow up with me offline if you have any other specific questions. So the first few pages here are just kind of background data on you as the applicant and the project, agency with ownership and maintenance responsibility, project length, other data points like traffic counts. If you don't have exact numbers from counters, estimates are better than nothing. Field 6 is where you would attach a bridge inspection report if your project contains a bridge. Field 8 is really important. This is where you'll estimate or provide data about traffic counts and the percentage of daily traffic accessing federal lands. Again, if you have counter data, that's great. But if you don't, go ahead and estimate. This is one of the crucial pieces that we look at in evaluating the applications. And you locals are going to know better than us how these roads are being used. Field 9 is where you get into crash data. Again, if you don't have exact numbers, you can provide anecdotal information here. And then in field 10 is where you'd indicate if there's an FLTP project in proximity. Feel free to reach out to local rangers or park superintendents, see if there are any of those kinds of projects in the area. And again, this is something we'll make the land management agencies aware of. Page 3 of the application gets into information about the proposed project. So this is where you can explain the purpose and need and alignment with the FLAP program. This is also where you'll provide a detailed description of the proposed work, including if the project could be phased. It's an important one because maybe we can fund part of a project, but not the whole thing. So it helps us to know what's most critical priority-wise and if the project could be phased. Page 4 gets into right-of-way, utility, and environmental considerations. So again, it's okay if you don't have all this information when you submit. If we do get to the point of sending a scoping engineer, they will flesh all of these details out during a scoping visit. But if you do have information about, right-of-way, utilities, that kind of stuff is helpful for us. Your local public works or roads department or state DOT can help you with some of these. And this is also where you'll indicate the proposed lead agency there in field 10. Again, typically this will be us, Central Federal Lands, unless there's a compelling reason for another agency to lead the project. The next page is project cost estimation and funding sources. So this part is really just for us to get a rough order of magnitude cost. We're not trying to get down to penny estimates. And we have provided a cost estimation workbook in the application materials that you can download. They are a little technical, so if you have a roadway engineer on staff to help you out, that can be helpful. You can also use your own estimating tools and workbooks. In general, I would say, be conservative with your estimates. That is, it's better to overestimate than underestimate the cost. And this is also where you'd indicate if there's any leveraged funds or non-flat funds. And there's a text box at the bottom of the page where you can describe that in narrative. This is also where you'll mention if there's an FLTP project in the area. Again, we'll make sure the FLMAs are aware of that. This is what the cost estimate templates look like. And we do have different tabs. It's an Excel file. We have different tabs for different kinds of projects. So there's a paved road tab, gravel road tab, multi-use path tab, parking. And we have tried to pre-populate these spreadsheets with some easy formulas. So whoever's doing the estimation, they'll be entering quantities, and then you'd get an output for a total project cost at the bottom there. And then you put that total number into page 5 of the application here, cost estimate number 22. Okay, so evaluation criteria. It is up to the PDC to set the exact evaluation criteria and the weighting of these categories, but it will be some configuration of these sort of 9 elements here. Some are sort of like a binary yes, no, and then some are scored on a points basis. These are all pretty straightforward, but I'll just run through them real quick. So federal lands access, proximity, and significance. So again, the closer to the federal lands unit, the better, the stronger nexus, the better. High use rec or federal economic generator, which we spoke about. Public access, safety improvement. Of course, safety is always an important one. Preservation. This is kind of more about asset management and state of good repair. Sustainability and environmental. Does this help with land management objectives of the agency? Project cost and risk, partnerships and coordination, and then finally alignment with FLAP's program and vision. So when you're filling out these applications, just keep these criteria in mind and speak to them as much as you can. We've also provided non-construction worksheets for transit planning and research projects. So this is kind of less quantitative and more narrative based. If you have a non-construction project, I'd say the best ones have some sort of clear path that would lead to a future construction project. Things like corridor plans, feasibility studies, where there's a need, but you aren't really sure what the right project might be. Or there needs to be some, more public engagement, consensus building before a project can proceed. Transit is always kind of a tough one. since FLAP is a one-time infusion of capital, it doesn't really make sense to try and stand up a transit operation with FLAP alone, since operations and maintenance costs can be significant and they're ongoing. But say if like an existing transit operator needs funding for maybe some capital improvements or maybe even rolling stock acquisition, those might fare a little better. This is the endorsement form that the facility owner needs to fill out. It's just one page, but it's so we know that someone is, basically on the hook for upkeep of the facility once it's been turned over. We wouldn't want to make an investment, in a new road and then have the road be abandoned or fall into some kind of disrepair. And then similarly, this is the FLMA support form, also just one page, but this helps us see that, there was coordination and collaboration between the land management units and the local agencies. We wouldn't want to fund a project that's not in alignment with the management objectives of the land management agency. And this is a critical element of eligibility, so don't forget this one. And then lastly, there's an instruction sheet and check. This is just to sort of keep you guys organized, make sure you didn't miss anything. And this is also where you would post a link to a video of the project. Again, this is optional, but some of these do really help the PDC in getting to know your project, and it kind of provides you an opportunity to market and sell the project. Okay, so this is our timeline for Texas. We'll have the call for projects open for about 3 months. From February 15th to May 15th. We're targeting to have our deliberative process complete by July so that we can have a shortlist meeting sometime in August. And then we'd be looking at project scoping in the fall and winter so that we could have a final programming meeting sometime maybe by February 2027. And that would give us construction of selected projects sometime in the probably 28, 29, 2030 timeframe. But a lot of that can be project dependent, so that can move around. Here's a general process if your project is selected. If you're shortlisted, it's kind of the first gate. You'll get a notification letter from us, and we'll set up some meetings to talk through any financial arrangements if leverage funds are being used. We also have an engagement letter that the project rep will sign. And then we'll work with you to set up, a site visit for our scoping engineers to refine those cost estimates, make sure we're in the ballpark and there's no major fatal flaws with the project. And if the project still looks good, PDC will place the project into our final program and then work out a delivery schedule. And we'll take it from there. Again, we'll deliver these things from cradle to grave, and that includes, right-of-way, utility, environmental clearances, design, construction, and then finally to close out. Also important to note that there's really no administrative burden on the applicant, as is the case with like other federal grants. That's because FLAP isn't a grant. It kind of looks and feels like one, but it's a formulaic program, and the funds stay on the federal side. So once a project is awarded, the applicant doesn't have to go through, extensive reporting or anything like that. As I mentioned earlier, if another agency is delivering the project, there will be some oversight by the state DOT and FHWA division office, and that can get a little more involved from the applicant's perspective. But again, those are kind of rare circumstances. Okay, so just finally wrapping up, tips for success. I say this every time, FLMA coordination is crucial. Sometimes we'll get applications where there was no discussion at all between the applicant and the land management agency. Those projects aren't going to score too well. Review program guidance for eligibility. Again, I'm your resource to this thing. So, if you got a project, you're not really sure it's eligible, feel free to shoot me an email. We'll kind of talk through the details. All of the application forms are just Adobe Acrobat fillable forms, but go ahead and download those and test those, make sure they work for you. You don't want to be scrambling last minute because of a software glitch. Answer as many questions as completely as possible, but sometimes less can be more. Sometimes we'll get these very extensive applications that have a lot of kind of padding and fluff in them, and the use only the amount of paper and ink needed to communicate the purpose and need of the project, and no more. And it's helpful for us too, right? Review the evaluation criteria. Again, those 7 or 9 different criteria we went over earlier in the presentation here. And then finally provide best data available. So, ADT, traffic counts, visitation data if it's available. If not, estimates, assumptions are great. If there's going to be, some right-of-way or utility conflicts, those drawings can help us. So if you could provide those things, that's always helpful. Bridge and pavement reports, if available. And really, that's kind of it. I know that was a lot of information I threw at you guys, but Julia and Jill and myself are again your resources through this process, and we're happy and willing to stay online if anyone has any questions. I know there's at least a couple of folks that had some questions. We're looking for great projects here in Texas in this call. So thanks for your time.
Thanks for your time. Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yes, please. Is this Mikey?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Thank you again. Yeah, this is super informative. Okay, so this is pretty granular, but maybe relevant for other folks as well. And we've had a bunch of conversations with our regional Fish and Wildlife Service transportation coordinator. So maybe I didn't understand, or there's some coupling between what we understand them to have said and what we heard today. But so our proposal is going to be it's not planning and research, but it's design. So it's not construction of a facility. It's to go from 20% to like 90% for about 10 miles of a shared use path. That shared use path is is managed by 2 different agencies. Part of it's in the state right of way and part of it's in county right of way. So the guidance we received was that it would be appropriate for and actually it's 2 county right of ways. So our partnership is 2 counties and the state DOT to connect to a Fish and Wildlife Service facility. The guidance we received from the region was that the counties could jointly apply as the primary applicants, and the state DOT could provide a letter of support, or some kind of formal letter of commitment or something, acknowledging that part of the project is located on the right of way, and that if the project, when the project is to be constructed, then at that point they would have maintenance responsibilities for the facility once it's constructed. But they're not. The state DOT doesn't want to be the lead applicant for the phase of the project. They just want to be involved in the construction. So I don't know. Does that sound right? Is that okay? Are we approaching that?
Yeah.
So ultimately, what we'll have is actions from 2 county commissioners courts saying, here's the person from county 1, here's the person from county 2. That are authorized, to work on this project for jurisdictions, and then we'll have something formal from the DOT that says we're super aware of this project and involved in it, and it's part of it is on our right of way, and we're cool with that, and we want the project to move forward with the understanding that once it's built, we'll maintain it. Is that okay?
Yeah, so I think you're good process-wise, and it sounds so design and engineering and stuff is eligible. Is there a path for construction somehow, somewhere, and who would be delivering the project eventually?
Yes. I guess not. I don't know exactly what there are multiple paths for construction.
Okay.
But since it is on state DOT, it is owned by the state, and it's this connection is part of like a state priority trail that
Mhm.
likely, I mean, it is anticipated that the state would be responsible for paying for construction either through like another a discretionary grant or I don't know, some other mechanism. So I'm not sure what their plan would be, like how they would exactly make that decision, but certainly the expectation is that the state DOT would pay for construction.
So the hitch there, and we could talk about this a little bit more maybe offline, is it's typical. It's not typical practice to have one agency design and spec something and another agency deliver it, because each agency has their own kind of
Right.
design and guidelines and methods and things. If we somehow could get alignment between, like, say, our design folks and the state DOT, if they're the ones going to deliver it, maybe that could work. But I think we would need to work through that a little bit for your application, because if it's unclear,
Okay.
I think the PDC might look at that and say, we wouldn't want to invest money in designing in design and just have it not be useful for the ultimate delivery agency. But yeah, we can figure that out.
Sorry to hog the time, just one more follow-up. Is it would it be better to say that the expectation is that DOT, or that it would be built through like a future flap or some other federal mechanism than to say that the state DOT would build it?
Probably.
Is the state DOT, I guess if they're committed to this project and they have a source of funding, or it sounds like maybe want to build it themselves, would they be willing to just bring those funds to the project now and then help, using that as leverage funds, and then CFL could design and deliver it through construction?
Well, part of it they are. The flap work that we're proposing would be to go from like 20% to 90% design. 0 to 20, part of that is funded through the DOT. So there is some like skin in the game for this phase, but I guess for the entirety of design, or I guess for completing design, I'm not sure we could look into that though.
So I would guess if someone else has started design, they may want just flap funds to contribute to someone else continuing design, or we would be taking somebody else's design files, putting them into our system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that would be a bit clunky.
Yeah, it might be and especially if it's the state DOT, they know how to administer federal funds. So it might be the cleanest thing just to request that the state DOT receive flat funds for this phase of the project, right? Rather than have us do the design. That might be the cleanest thing.
Okay. Well, I don't want to, this is very specific. So, but would it be okay for us to reach out directly to you to continue?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. It looks like we got Haley up next.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey
Okay.
there.
I just had a quick question on like project eligibility. So we have 2 lakes in our area that have U.S. Army Corps managed like parks and then wildlife management areas. And I just wanted to confirm that those areas, say we're looking to redo the roadway, like the county or city roadway up to those areas, that would be eligible, correct?
Yeah, from the way you're describing it,
Mm-hmm.
yep, that sounds eligible. If it's like leading to the recreation, and
Yes.
we consider the federal lands as like the water in this case,
Okay.
will be eligible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and looks like Angie has her hand up.
Yes, I'm sorry if you addressed this. I don't think you completely did, but you kind of touched on it. And we're in Texas, so that's $3.2 million. And as you mentioned, that's not a lot. But are you able to give us a sense of like how many applications or how many awards you've had in the past for our state, for example, because I know we're a large state, because I'm kind of trying to get a feel for like how realistic it is to get as much funding as we need for our project. And before you answer that, I do want to say, this was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you guys so much. So I think you've laid it out really well for folks who have not applied before. Thank you so much.
Good to hear it. So Jill's got a little more history on Texas than I have. I think we'll probably maybe fund two projects, two, maybe three projects.
Yeah, so just looking at last call, we had 14 applications. And of those, let's see, we selected, I'm just looking in the old files. Of the 14 applications, we selected 1, 2, 3 projects, of which, I mean, technically 2 dropped out, but we selected 3 projects of the 14 in the last cycle. The cycle before that, let me just look here, we had or we might have selected 4 projects with 2 remaining, actually. The year before that, we only had 4 applications. So yeah, in our 2019 call, we only had 4 applications. So it's kind of hard to say how many, between 4 to 14 is a pretty big difference.
Sure. And I'm so sorry. I just thought of a follow-up question with that then. So if our application, I mean, like, so so it sounds like you may, depending, of course, what's eligible, what scores high, all of that. If there's 2, 3, 4 projects you end up funding. But is that kind of like, if let's say if a project is I guess what I'm trying to get at is, okay, you have $3.2 million, but does that kind of like, okay, the first project that you're kind of ranking it, there's just 2.8 million. So there's 400,000 left for the next project, or how does that?
Let me clarify a little. So Texas gets about maybe 3.3 million a year, and we don't really know what we're going to get in the next legislation. So just assuming it stays the same, we usually program 2 to 4 years of funding. I think Andrew mentioned that at the beginning, but so we could be programming up to $14 million, but just keeping in mind that's for total project costs. So that's design, engineering, environmental compliance, everything. So still, I mean, $14 million, that could be one really great larger project, or it could be 2 or 3 smaller projects. And it just depends what comes out of it. So the other thing the PDC sometimes does is they take a look at the scope and see what part of the project they like. Like if it's like, 20 miles of road and then a parking lot rehab, and like they see the value in the parking lot rehab, they might say, hey, we'll give you some money towards this parking lot. So what's really helpful for the PDC is there's a section in the application that says, can this project be phased? And if there's any opportunities for a partial project, just saying what your priorities would be. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it's, 4 miles and the full 4 miles leads to the, the destination, and it doesn't make sense to phase it. But if it's 3 parking lots and a half a mile of road, like it helps to say these are the in order of priorities. And the PDC sometimes considers that. Or if you say, like, we understand that this, goes through a residential area and maybe 20% of the traffic is accessing residential homes and not the federal lands, it is very helpful to try to leverage funds to say, we're going to contribute because of this, we're going to contribute 200,000 because, or $1 million or whatever it is. But the PDC does look at that and say, this is a very urban job. And a large portion of these folks are not accessing the federal lands. That doesn't fully meet the intent of the FLAP program. And so that's when providing some sort of supplemental funding, I think, helps the project too. So having, identifying priorities, if there are some, And then, if there can be leverage funds, and I know everybody's tight on funding right now, but that also helps.
Yes, sorry, I had my mute on. Yes, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like Mel has her hand up. Or
Hi, I just have two questions that came up while other people were asking questions, and also like to echo this has been super, super helpful as someone who's not done it before. So the first one, I used the tool that was on the FLAP website that identified federal lands, but it only showed one area. For reference, I'm in South Texas, so it just showed a state park. We're coastal though. This is a dumb question. Like, is anything touching the water considered leading to federal lands, or is that not really the intent of FLAP? And then follow-up question, it wasn't listed on the website, but we also have some U.S. Army Corps like infrastructure, more utilitarian, like flood walls and whatnot. That doesn't really contribute to economic, but I guess the flood protection does protect economic assets. So those are the two things I wasn't sure if they would be eligible for this one specifically.
So I would want to look. So what are you with the county?
I'm with the city, but we do work closely with the county. The specific one is the Mustang Island Park on the island. We have a couple of paper streets that we were going to submit here because, it helps the connectivity and all that good stuff. So that was the ones we were looking at. Now for everything else, like I said, we're on the coast. So we do have a lot of projects that increase access to the coastline. Or
Yeah,
even some like marina projects too.
So that barrier island system in
Mhm.
South Texas, there's a fair bit of federal lands footprint throughout there. So I'd want to see exactly what. Maybe we could follow up. Talk about what kind of projects you're talking about. The utilitarian stuff, the public access component comes in there, so that's why recreation is kind of becomes a catch-all. Because if it's like a dam and it's controlled access, but it's owned by Army Corps or Reclamation or something like that, wouldn't be eligible because it's not public access. So the idea is to enhance people going outdoors with this kind of side thing of like economic generation.
Okay, makes sense.
I
guess send you a screenshot of.
Follow up.
Perfect. I'll just reach out and send an email with what I'm looking at, because what I saw was just that one park. But yeah, to my knowledge, there's a lot more than that besides the bases and whatnot.
Yeah, certainly.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. I don't see any other hands up. Anyone else have any questions? John Serrano.
Yeah. Hi, Andrew. Thanks again for, walking us through this process. I am also from the same agency that Angie is from. And so, without revealing our entire hand here, we are thinking of applying through this, I guess, program for a trail, and we're trying to see how we can make the application more competitive. And so if we were to incorporate, like some green infrastructure elements or like shade structures or anything like that, would that increase the competitiveness aside from just saying, hey, we want to design and build this trail that leads to, federal lands?
Yeah, good question. It's eligible, wouldn't increase competitiveness. So I would think when you're, this goes for really everyone, think of the human dimension first, and then kind of the other kind of components secondarily. If it's enhancing people accessing federal recreation, that's what's going to be the main driver for competitiveness. And then, you know, shade structures, signage, wayfinding, bioswale, you know, green infrastructure, that kind of stuff. Nice to have, but wouldn't go one way or another as far as competitiveness.
Awesome. I think that answered my question there. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anyone else? We got pretty good attendance today, so it'll be probably a decent, you know, batch of projects for us to review. Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Again, all of this information will be on the web page, and happy to do follow-ups one-on-one with the group. Appreciate everybody's time, and we're looking forward to some fun projects in Texas. So thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon.